Welcome to Trending in Education, a very special episode. I'm joined today by Howard Gardner, who's a real luminary in the world of psychology and mind and all sorts of things. Howard is the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's also a founding member of Harvard's Project Zero. He's now got two new books out, The Essential Howard Gardner on Education and The Essential Howard Gardner on Mind. For those of you watching, Howard is holding these up right now. We're joined today by Howard, who's got so much going on. There's only so much we can talk about in our short time together. Howard, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you. Glad to be here with you and your audience.
It's amazing to have you. We always like to start with our guests' origin stories, where maybe an abridged version of that, because you've got quite a lot in your background. But can you catch folks up however you want to frame it? I know you've also written a memoir, The Synthesizing Mind. So however you want to frame it up for us, can you introduce folks who might not be familiar with you to who you are and how you got here?
Sure. Probably the most timely point is that I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, 81 years ago.
Hmm.
So those are two things that I share with President Joe Biden, but
Oh, yeah.
we don't know each other. I was always interested in education. My mother was trained to be a kindergarten teacher. And when I was young, I assumed that when I got older, I would be teaching every grade from kindergarten right through high school. I didn't know about college at the time. I then went to college and became interested in social sciences and eventually in psychology. And my training is in developmental psychology. I was a student, so to speak, of Jean Piaget, the cognitive psychologist, and Erickson, the psychoanalyst. Probably the person who influenced me the most was Jerome Bruner, who was a psychologist very well known in education because of his book, The Process of Education, which really was quite revolutionary when it came out in 1960. As you said, Mike, I've been a founding member of Project Zero, a research group at Harvard Education School, which is focused on developing ideas about education and then giving them a push in the right direction. That
Hmm.
means not running schools or museums or businesses, but trying to develop ideas. The one which I'm most best known for is the idea of multiple intelligences, which without any particular expectation on my part really did become viral, as they say.
Yeah, you were viral before viral was a thing. You were viral in like the 80s.
And yet, the one reason for putting out the two volumes of my collected papers, I've wandered very widely across the educational and psychological space. The last 30 years, I've been interested particularly in ethics and morality as part of what I call the Good Project, the Good Work Project. And as we were chatting beforehand, I've become very interested in AI and what it means about the training of the mind. And we're about to host an essay called Who Owns Intelligence? Because it used to be owned by the psychometric community with the IQ test. And
Mhm.
I played a big role in exploding that hegemony, if you will.
Thank you for your service. I'll speak for my listeners and the rest of the world. Thank you for your service.
Okay. Pluralizing the notion of intelligence to intelligences. But since then, we now have claims of animal intelligence. We have claims of plant intelligence, which I would have thought was ridiculous when I was young, but no longer. And of course, artificial intelligence. As it happens, we're speaking on the day after two men, both of whom I know somewhat, John Hopfield and Jeff Hinton, have won the Nobel Prize in physics, not for doing physics, but for doing artificial intelligence.
Right.
Anybody involved in education who thinks that we can be an ostrich and just put our heads under the ground and ignore AI is just not doing a service to the next generation. Well, I've wandered across a very wide map. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to have been doing this. You might say I was born at the right time and in the right place. But as an educator, as a parent, and having five grandchildren ranging from 4 to college age, I, of course, am very interested in how we educate the mind in the full sense in the generations to come.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot in there, but maybe following up a little bit on the Good Project. One of the things that you talk about in there, you kind of break down your triple helix of excellence, engagement, and ethics. as sort of like the three-legged stool, I guess, in terms of what we're trying to impart through education, but also perhaps just as humans, trying to give something back and really try to convey something to future generations. Can you summarize a little bit how you landed there? And, this also maybe ties a bit to some of the synthesizing you've been doing, where, you know, as someone who's prolific really throughout your 81 years, you've really accumulated a massive body of work. And then, what I've been struck by is how you're making connections and, starting to do that synthesizing exercise.
Well, you're a wonderful publicist for me. I appreciate that very, very much. Yeah, literally 30 years ago, 94, 95, I was privileged to be able to spend a year with two colleagues, both of whom are quite well known. Mike Csikszentmihalyi was the father of flow, that
Hmm.
psychological state where you're so deeply involved in things that you lose track of space and time. The other is Bill Damon, very much with us today. He's become best known in recent years for his studies of purpose, what it means for an individual purpose, which is to have a goal you want to achieve, but it's not just about you. It's about what you can give to the broader society. So
Hmm.
the three of us spent a year together pondering the question, can you be creative and humane at the same time? AI is actually a wonderful example of that. We would never have AI if people hadn't been highly creative, but now we see it could take over the world and the planet and destroy it. So we
Right.
began to investigate that in the early 90s, 1994, 95, and that eventually gave rise to what we call the Good Project. And the Good Project, as you said, involves three different strands. Someone who is a good worker, a good citizen is excellent. They know what they're doing. They're engaged, otherwise they would fly off and do something else. But the third thing, which is what I focus on, is they're ethical. Ethical means you wrestle very hard with what is the right thing to do, and then you try your best to do it. Nobody gets it all the time. But one of the things about ethical people is that when we screw up, we try to figure what did we do wrong? How could we do it better next time? And so
Hmm.
on. And my research group at Harvard Project Zero launched something called the Good Project. There's a massive amount of data available on it online. But what I think of particular interest to your listeners, watchers, is that the Good Project has developed a curriculum for high school and middle school where we try to help students figure out not only what they want to do, what they think is important, but what's the best way to go about it? Not just to aggrandize yourself, but also to do something which is best for the world. And I'm going to make this rather dramatic. In my day, the person whom I admired the most was Gandhi,
Mm.
because Gandhi really understood what you needed to preserve the world, to transcend particular religions, and to express your disbelief, your disagreement with things without becoming violent.
Hmm.
Nowadays, in much of the world, the most admired person is Elon Musk.
Hmm.
And there's much to admire in Elon Musk, but I certainly would not want to put him in charge of our fates. And
Right.
so, young people in particular, but we're looking at election now, old people too, are very attracted to somebody who's glamorous, who's
Hmm.
an influencer. Elon Musk is probably the leading influencer among people who, read something other than Taylor Swift's diaries. But is Elon Musk really the person we want to give the fate of the planet or indeed of Mars to? And so we want kids to wrestle with this. We do this in the Good Project. And I've actually started a project with my colleagues just a year or two ago called Good Starts, because even though I think one can be concerned about ethics and morality in adults, in college kids, in high school, and in middle school, I think it starts much earlier. So we're interested in how very young kids in preschool, 3, 4, 5 years of age, begin to think about I, we, and they. They certainly know who I is, but to what extent do they identify with other people and try to help them? How broad is that notion of I? How
Hmm.
does it become we? And since we isn't everybody, when you have they, you can be neutral about them, you can admire them, but you can also want to annihilate them.
Right.
And you've all heard the phrase, it takes a village. In Africa, the notion of Ubuntu really takes very seriously that any child, the whole environment, the whole school, the whole village is responsible for that. In the United States, alas, it's very much the other way.
Yeah.
We have the cartoon from the New Yorker where mother is walking her child to preschool and says, well, make sure you do the right networking when you get there. And it's not designed to join the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
It's designed to join a Wall Street firm and make as much money as possible. It
Right.
isn't bad in itself, but if it's not used generously, it is bad.
Yeah. And as a parent of a 5-year-old, you're certainly hitting close to home when you talk about the Good Starts Project. And I've been struck by how fortunate Matthew has been in that the social emotional component of his education has been very much front and center in his early days.
Thank you. What you said, actually, Michael, triggered something which is important to me. In the second book, the Essential Howard Gardner Mind, I finished up this past spring, and I said, well, what are the things that I'm starting now that I'm not at all sure I'm going to be able to push because I'm old?
Yeah.
Um, and I created the last essay is called Had I Willed Enough in Time?
Mm.
That's actually a line from poet Andrew Marvell, had
Hmm.
well enough in time. And I talk about the things which, if I drop dead tomorrow or get seen, what's the work I would like to be able to have carried on? And I
Mm.
talk about the good starts because it's so much easier get a good start and the right start in life to be excellent and engaged, but also ethical than it
Right.
is to stumble off in the wrong direction. And the most major research that I've been involved with Wendy Fishman over the last 15, 20 years has been a study of American colleges.
Yes.
You wrote a book that's beginning to be recognized a lot called The Real World of College.
Hmm.
It came out in 2022 in the middle of the pandemic. But we discovered that college, which people I know took so seriously, is a very troubled institution nowadays, that most of the students who go there don't really understand why they're in college, except maybe it is to get a job. But if
Hmm.
it's just to get a job, they should go into job training or go to intern at a corporation or at a business or at a store or at a nonprofit. The American higher education system is based on the idea that professional education isn't the job of college. That's why you go on to law school or medical school or engineering school or business school. You could also major in that in college, but then it becomes a professional school.
Mm.
But we came to the conclusion based on 2,000 interviews that the reason that we have this unique system where we don't professionally educate right away is because the age of 18 to 22, or let's say to 25, is the best time to let your mind explore, grow, learn how to deal with new issues, being very contemporary, knowing how to think about what's going on in Israel or Palestine, what's
Mm.
going on in a presidential election, what's going on with different notions of the economy, what's
Mm.
going on with democracy. And
Yeah.
most people who are 15 are not capable of doing that. The American college, which got its tremendous push forward after the Second World War with the GI Bill, was a
Yep.
tremendous gift to people of my generation and your generation to have a chance to explore, expand, and to think broadly about things. And I think part of America's success in the latter half of the 20th century was because we had so many people who had a broad education, but that's disappearing now. It's either people are attacking college altogether, and there's a
Mm.
huge amount of that, more from the right wing than from the left, or they're seeing it simply as job training, in which
Yep.
case we can get rid of the professors, the libraries, the museums, the research laboratories. Why do Americans get the Nobel Prize? You know, it's not because professional training starts at 18. It's because they had a chance to, in fact, reading Jeffrey Hinton, who just got the Nobel Prize yesterday, he studied both physics and psychology. And the original press release said, well, I flunked psychology and dropped out of physics. He said, I'd rather have, don't have the quote exactly right. He didn't want it to look like he'd flunked out of psychology.
Right. You're gonna flunk out at something, might as well be physics.
But
Yes.
the important point, Michael and listeners, is the American system and the British system, especially Oxford and Cambridge, allow you not to commit yourself to professions when you're 18.
Hmm.
And the German system, which I admire in many ways, At 11, you go into a vocational track. You never learn about languages. You never learn about history. You never learn about art. You never learn about philosophy. You never
Yeah.
learn about basic science. You said you're going to be a tradesman or
Mm.
tradesperson.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and perhaps that's a natural way to get back into the artificial intelligence and the future of work, the future of intelligence, where, a lot of those models were established 500 years ago, depending on where you're talking, and how relevant are they for the disruption and the transformation that we're in the midst of? You mentioned before that we're no longer alone on the stage here. There are new agentic intelligences that are emerging. Domains that we thought were uniquely human are now a shared space where we have to think, how do we collaborate? How do we get the most out of these artificial intelligences? But then also, there is a blending that happens when we are engaging with these things. I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on where you see some of this stuff going.
Sure. I probably have the same knowledge base that most of your listeners. That is, I read a lot about it and I monkey around a bit by it, but it's as revolutionary as the inventing of the alphabet or the printing press,
Yep.
maybe more so. But what I'm going to say is, I think obvious, but it's still important to take it seriously. We cannot be ostriches. We cannot say, oh, we're going to forget about AI. We're just going to do things as we always did. For one thing, your students are going to be using AI to write papers, and you can't pretend that you don't know that. So
Mhm.
we can't afford to be ostriches. On the other hand, we can't afford to be lemmings. I just came off with that analogy. We can't afford to say, well, let's let AI take over. We can't say, well, we're just going to turn over education to AI, give everybody a laptop and a smartphone and close the schools. That would be silly. So the answer that's obvious, but it needs to be taken seriously, is we need to learn enough about these systems to see what they can do well, what they may be able to do well in the future, what it is that we have a competitive advantage in as human beings, individually, as a group, as a species, because we are a species, and to kind of hold hands together as much as possible. It may also be, this is sort of the science fiction version, but it may be in the lifetime of some of our listeners and viewers, we may have implants in our brain, which
Mhm.
are more AI-ish, and then it's going to happen in the skull. It's not going to happen with a laptop or a hand.
Yeah. I just saw Apple's AirPods are now being used as hearing aids, which is sort of a logical extension, but it's the same kind of idea where the technologies are kind of integrating more closely with ourselves, even the level to which, we are checking our phones, those of us who maybe aren't as disciplined as we could be, the level to which we are already in some ways blending with the technology.
Well, here's a phrase that just popped up to me, and it's not meant as an advertisement for Facebook. We need to become meta in a sense.
Hmm.
By that I mean, if there are machines that do stuff so much better than human beings, only those of us as human beings who want to learn how to do them should spend the time and the effort requisite to do it. But going meta means we need to understand what it is that we've uploaded or downloaded to another machine
Hmm.
or entity, and when necessary, to pull the plug and say,
Right.
no, this is not something. I mean, ethics, for example, um, I'm actually happy if a um, smart device helps me as a parent or as a worker or as a lawyer or as a judge to weigh all the evidence. But I'm not happy to go along with the conclusion just because the entity says it should. I have to go meta and say, well, how could it have gotten wrong? If, for
Mhm.
example, and this is the best known example, we're taking advice on whom to hire or what decision to make in a jury case or in a judge case, if it turns out that 80% of the examples come from white middle class males, that's not a suitable base. And at least as a human being, we can say that's a skewed sample. We need to have a much broader sample and maybe just not an American sample before we reach that decision.
Hmm.
Now, I'm a language person. I learned to read at an early age. Wrote at an early age. As long as my brain still fires, I'll be writing. As you probably know, I've written hundreds of blogs the past few years. So it'd be no reason in the world for me to consign that to some kind of a large language machine. But
Yeah.
many people who are dyslexic or dysgraphic, they have great difficulty learning to read and learning to write. I wouldn't force them to knock their head against the wall for 10 years to get somewhat better, but I wouldn't let them consign the summary or the decision just to the smart machine because
Hmm.
they still have to use their judgment.
Hmm.
And as we were speaking earlier on issues of ethics and morality, it's very, very important that as human beings, we take responsibility for those decisions and we not simply consign. I'll use something that's on everybody's mind as we're speaking. There's a war going on in the Middle East, and it's
Hmm.
very, very complicated. They have Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Now, uh, if I were the president or the secretary of state or Jake Sullivan, I might very well want to know what kind of a recommendation a bunch of smart machines made, especially if they made the same recommendation. They might well not. Meta might have a very different recommendation than Alpha, whatever these come. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with the White House or with the Kremlin or with the EU or with Prince Mohammed bin Saleh, whatever his name is, and they can't say, well, the machine said this is what I should do. So I think that's what educators need to grapple with. I certainly feel that everybody needs to know what we call the three R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. And as you know, having looked at my work, I'm very much in favor of the disciplined mind, meaning understanding the major disciplines, historical, scientific, humanistic.
Hmm.
And as we've already spoken about, I think that knowing that it's not easy to figure out what the best thing to do, the right thing to do is, but we need to wrestle with that. We should all be equipped by that, for that by our education, which can be parent, it can be school, it can be religious institution, it can be the boys club, the girls club, it can be social media. Don't give too much power to influencers. That's a dangerous way to go. But at the end of the day, we need to make our own decisions. We individually, we as families, we as social groups, we as individual countries, we as the globe about what the best thing to do for the planet and for the species. And there, you probably know the example. It's gotten a lot of attention a lot. There's some a thought experiment where an economic and political decision is given to a smart machine, and it says, well, the solution to everything is more paper clips. And so it produces so many paper clips that the oceans are overwhelmed and the planet disappears, and only Elon Musk survives on Mars.
Was that Clippy? Was that Microsoft's old help paperclip icon that used to provide you? No, it probably wasn't Clippy. Yeah.
It may be, but the point was you could easily come up with a scenario, a brave new world scenario,
Yeah.
given all of the input that the smart machine has. It says, well, paper clips are really precious and important, so we got to keep producing them.
Yeah.
In the end, we're flooded by them and we drown.
Yeah. Hmm. Well,
So
it's sort of, it speaks to, I guess, the importance of critical thinking and the executive function. I've heard it described as too, where, you're getting all these inputs and then ultimately, you know, it's on you to make the decision. Although increasingly there will be questions of where you can actually allow the artificial intelligence to make a decision, where a lot of folks now are talking about the importance of keeping humans in the loop. It does remind me of a quote attributed to Charles Eames, which is never delegate understanding, where there is a fundamental responsibility that we have. This maybe gets back to the ethics component that you were talking about, to actually engage in meaningful labors, to actually do the hard work, to engage in the productive struggle that's involved in learning. There are ethical dimensions to learning, and I'd love to hear more about that. Like, how do you think about how we cultivate our intelligences and how, in some sense, there's a responsibility that each of us have to really become the best version of ourselves?
okay, thanks for that question. I'm now going to mention something that I've been working on myself for many years. I think it's important, but it hasn't really had the influence that I would have hoped for. And that's the distinction between neighborly morality and the ethics of roles.
Mm.
Well, neighborly morality would be familiar to anybody. It's what we learn in the Ten Commandments, what we learn in the Golden Rule. It's how do we treat the people near us, family, friends, members of our community? I don't think I have anything new to say about that. I think the Golden Rule, uh, the Ten Commandments, Christ's teachings, and I'm sure it's the same for other religious leaders.
Mhm.
What's neighborly morality? How do you deal with people around you? The ethics of roles, in contrast, is a rather new concept in the sense that both the roles of being a professional and the roles of being a citizen are relatively new roles.
Mm.
Now, when I say professions, that's more familiar to people. I mean, being a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a journalist, those are professions.
Mm.
And when I talk about the ethics of roles, when you say we want to become a lawyer or a journalist or a teacher, you don't really know what kind of dilemmas you're going to face there. You know what kind of dilemmas you're going to face when your neighbor hits your kid or gives your kid something the president doesn't want.
Don't get me started on what their dog might do. Yeah.
Right. But as a journalist, I say something that's not in good taste. You have to make a decision whether to show that or not.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
haven't been trained for that. Neighborly morality, as I say, is something that I have nothing particular to contribute to. But what it means to be a knowledgeable worker and a knowledgeable citizen, these are relatively new concepts for the last few centuries. They didn't exist in the same sense hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And that's the kind of education which has to happen in the later years of school and the first years as a job and the first years as a voter. And this is the kind of thinking which, to follow up on your question, is not the kind of thing that we should download to any kind of artificial system. You need to take responsibility as a journalist, a podcast, for what you present and how you present it. And when you and I go to the polls, I'll use a concrete example everybody will understand. I live in Massachusetts, and number one on our ballot is, should we get rid of the MCAS? This is the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment. And
Mm.
actually, my wife and I found we agreed, and we didn't agree with most of the voters. Find out in November who's right. But that's the decision where you need to know something. Uh, to say I hate tests or I love tests isn't enough.
Right.
So you really shouldn't vote unless you inform yourself about what the issues are.
Mm.
So the ethics of roles of being a good worker and a good citizen, that's something which our educational system broadly construed, not just what's in school, but what we read about in the journals, what we hear about on the street corner. These are things where we have to try to make the best kinds of decisions we can. And AI can be a help, but again, I don't want AI to make the decisions. I want to raise something which isn't in my books, though if the books were to come out next year, they would be. And it's a word which we've all heard, but it's one I'm just beginning to understand: the influencers.
Mm.
The influencers are people now who, as I understand, just get the most hits when they speak up about something, when they write about something. And in that position, they have enormous influence. That's why they're called influencers. But there's no guarantee that they're following either the Ten Commandments, neighborly morality, or that they're saying what it means to do good work as a citizen or as a professional. They're
Mhm.
simply saying the things which get the most hits. So
Right.
I wrote a book, and it was published in 2012, so a dozen years ago. I think it's one of the three most important books I've written. I've written too many books, but I've written lots of books. It was called Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed.
Mm.
And I talked about what truth was, what beauty was, and what goodness was traditionally, and how it needed to be rethought in the 21st century. That's a reframe made.
Mm.
Between the hardback and the softback, which was literally a year, I changed the introduction to the book and I changed the subtitle. The subtitle was Educating for the Virtues in the Era of Truthiness, and I forget what the other T was. It wasn't TikTok, but
Twitter?
yeah, that's right. Twitter and truthiness. Thank you. And so I was saying that even between 2011 and 2012, the way I thought truth, beauty, and goodness have been affected by social media.
Right.
I'm now going to blog about something called Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed in the era of the influencer.
Mm.
Because the influencer is simply an individual who in a sense has taken over truthiness and Twitter. It's the person who gets the most hits. And frankly, nobody is asking, has this person done the most research and talked to the most people and come up with the most thoughtful answer? They've
Mm,
said, what makes me want to come back again? Just like over half of the kids in the universe go to TikTok.
right,
And again, TikTok is the only goal of TikTok is to get you to come back to TikTok. So
right.
what does truth be and goodness mean in the age of the influencer?
Mhm.
And if I were rewriting that essay, had I wrote enough in time, I'd put in a section on what happens in the world of the influencer. And
Mm,
this is something, in a sense, most insightful philosophers and historians and playwrights knew, namely that the loud voice got a lot of attention.
mhm.
It was a very famous book, came out a century ago by Gustave Le Bon, a French sociologist, called The Crowd. But this was just a number of people who were were in your environment.
Right,
Now, the influencer, and I'll use Taylor Swift, about whom I have no positive or negative views. I mean, she says something, and there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who listen, or Elon Musk, you,
right,
you name the influencer. So that's something which was when Moses went up the mountain, there was nobody whispering in his ear saying, don't pay too much attention to today's influencer.
right. Yeah, it's interesting circling back to you were talking about professional ethics, like, influencer is a new emerging profession. I remember reading that, survey of young kids, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? A large proportion of them, much more so than an astronaut, for example, kids nowadays want to be influencers when they grow up. And they think about the influence, but they don't necessarily think about the ethics that should be paired with that. How should we teach ethics? How do we teach adult influencers ethics? That's an entirely different conversation. We could probably put that one aside. But, I'm sure through the Good Project, Good Starts, how do we teach it? Is it by struggle? Like, is it what giving people hard problems, understanding things are complicated? What's the best way to get people, to understand it and also be motivated to continue to struggle with these things?
That's a great question. And it's one we've thought about for a long time. And you're actually reminding me a decade or two before I heard the word influencer, I was already reporting the same phenomenon, namely when people are asked, do they want to discover the cure for cancer, be the president of a university, or be a celebrity? The kids were saying, and this is our kids, or at least my kids, they were saying being a celebrity. So the idea of influencer was there in 2000. But
Yeah.
the capacity for the influencer to dominate these things, and this is probably large compared,
Right.
that's a newer phenomenon. I think the best answer to your question is you have to do it developmentally.
Mhm.
And that is, we're working, as I say now, with preschoolers, and they're simply having a sense of I, we, and they, and what stance you should take to people that are similar to you and people different than you. That's, I think, the right way to go about it. That's what we would call enabling morality kind of way. And I think that's probably true until pre-adolescence. But once you get to the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, kids are already in that mediated world. When I was young, it was radio and the newspaper. When you were young, it was probably television. But now it's social media. I think you have to take cases which superficially look easy and simple, but the more that you probe into them, the more you see that they're very, very complicated. An example we used 20 years ago in the Good Project was you're a journalist and you're covering a war and you see somebody who's injured. What's your role?
Mm,
Let's say you're on the border between Gaza and the rest of Israel, and what's your role? It's not clear that the answer is simple. You've been basically authorized to be a journalist. Nobody's supposed to kill you because you're wearing a journalist. But do you intervene on one side? Um,
mm,
and I'm a teacher. This is an example for the early grades as much as later. There's one young people. I've got a class of 30 people. If I was in China, or India, it'd be 60 people. And one child needs a lot of attention, but there are 29 or 49 other kids there. How do you do that? It's not something that's a simple answer. And
mm.
the more you think about it, the more deeply you go into it, you realize there are options. Each of them has costs. And I don't know if I can remember them all, but we had a bunch of D's, dilemma, discuss, decide, deliberate, and then the last one, I can't remember what the D stood for, but reflected how we could have done it differently the next time. And
Yeah.
it's that cycle. And I think probably the most important teaching I've done, and we've done some research on this, is mentoring. Um,
Mm.
and in fact, Jean Nakamura, my Csikszentmihalyi's colleague, wrote a book called Good Mentoring. It's a worthwhile book. And mentoring means, especially if you're in a profession of teaching and scholarship, you learn from your teachers, your mentors, but then your job, and I think what I've taken most seriously, is the students that I work with, particularly are writing theses or they're doing research, what kind of a role model do I set? And what we found in good mentoring is this occurs across generations. It isn't just that I have a mentor and it stops there. My mentor was mentored, and I now have students that have already retired. And so I'm a great
Right.
mentor, and they're grad mentors, and so on. And, this is what the basis of religion has always been, whether it's a good religion or not religion, is the role models, positive and negative. By
Mm.
bad religion, I mean one that's bent upon destruction. And every religion has got good and bad aspects.
Mhm.
And it's easier if you live in a community that's stable. And that's why, if we look at the globe nowadays, it's those countries and those regions where you've had the most salient changes in generations, who lives there, who's next door, and so on. It's the
Yeah.
most difficult to establish some kind of an ethical and moral basis. Nonetheless, that's the world we live in. And that's
Mhm.
why we're studying I, we, and they, because everybody has they.
Right.
Well, don't look at them, don't talk like them. And do we ignore them? Better than hitting them, but not as good as trying to understand them and work with them and discover that people who look different often have more in common and share more aspirations than people who look just like us.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I'm thinking about the connection between, or the contrast perhaps, between the influencer and the mentor, where in some ways those two paths are emerging. Clearly, folks can do both. But I've also heard around AI that there is this cognitive surplus that's being created as we offload more things to artificial intelligence that should free up our human capacity to do other things. And perhaps there is some way to connect that back into these sort of pro-social things like mentorship, coaching, paying it forward. And then I imagine that on the other side, there's also a desire really to be mentored, to be brought along by those who have gone further, have seen more, and really are trying to give something back. It also circles back to, you mentioned Eric Erickson. I'm in the generativity versus stagnation phase of my life, but it does feel like we're all kind of facing these significant crises. And the best way to get through that, I've found, is to really have someone that you can trust and rely on. Thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I think the difference is very clear. Influencing is transient. If I'm an influencer and I find something doesn't work, I drop it and go do something else. Because for me, it's not the quality of my hearers or listeners, it's a number. Mentoring is over the long haul. The whole notion of good mentoring is Anna Freud trained Eric Erickson, who trained me. I have. And so it's mentoring is over the long run. It's maintenance.
Hmm.
And influence is trendy and transient. If you think the world's going to blow up, and I guess Elon Musk does think it's going to blow up, then who cares about anything over the long run? I think our planet has done many, many terrible things, but we've also done wonderful things. I'm very much involved in the arts, and I would hate to think that the music of Mozart would disappear with the planet. Now, you might say the Beatles or Taylor Swift, that's fine with me. It's music too. Similarly, whether it's paintings or works of literature or, statespeople, political people who, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and
Hmm.
Martin Luther King, those represent the heights of humanity, in my view, skewed toward males because that's who we knew about, but
Right.
certainly, there are equal numbers of saints and queens and heroines. And I want people to aspire to the best of our potential. listeners may find of interesting. I'm best known for the theory of multiple intelligences. The reason I could do the research for that is because my institution, Harvard, got a very large grant to study the nature and realization of human potential. Human potential was a term, and that gave me 5 years and lots of freedom to think about the different kind of potentialities that people have.
Hmm.
There, I realized that, being a good student and having high IQ is fine, but there's a lot more to human nature than that. And I laid out what I thought were the major intelligences. They're well known. But then I had the realization, particularly working with Csikszentmihalyi and Damon, that it's not enough to have a well-hewned intelligence. It's what you use the intelligence for. Both Goethe, the German playwright, and Goebbels, the German propagandist, used German language very well. Goethe wrote Faust and wonderful poetry and drama. Goebbels fomented hatred.
Hmm.
And you can fill in the blanks. We have people now who are using linguistic intelligence or musical intelligence or interpersonal intelligences for a positive ends. And we have people who use it just to foment hatred.
Hmm.
That's not something we should ever allow smart machines to do for us.
Yeah. It reminds me, I heard Abraham Maslow and self actualization, that what folks maybe missed is self actualization in service of what? It's not necessarily, I'm the Godhead, I'm blissed out on the mountaintop, and then I go back and live my day to day. It's really in service of purpose. Maybe as we're getting closer to conclusion here, there has been recent research around a loneliness epidemic, around the impact of social media. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, is getting a lot of attention. Are there ways that we can perhaps reach folks differently, engage with them differently? I come back to, this idea of shared experience, shared human experience as something that is ultimately a good. And it's something that I think we potentially can lose sight of. But I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective on, the crisis, like the mental health crisis that we're in the midst of, and maybe some rays of hope or some direction that you might be able to provide us in terms of how we can address some of these things.
Well, I'm not a mental health person, but Wendy Fishman and I discovered this over a decade ago when we interviewed 2,000 people in American colleges and universities, 10 disparate schools, some of which everybody would have heard of, some of which I hadn't heard of. And we discovered that mental health was the biggest problem.
Hmm.
And this was before the pandemic, it was the middle of the Obama administration. So it was a big surprise to us. So we wrote about it. And of course, now we're seen as having been prescient. We weren't prescient. Our research methods elicited to it. I've become very interested in religion. I'm not a religious person myself, but there's no question that people who feel that they belong to some kind of a group, who have people who they feel akin to, whether it's a relative or someone who has the same belief system, is very, very important to counter the feeling of loneliness and isolation. And as Haidt and other people have pointed out, often the reliance on these TikToks just makes it worse because these are people who you don't know, and yet they seem to be getting more hits than you do. And then people say some nasty things about you, and especially if you're a young woman, you're especially sensitive. I guess this is a cheap formula, but it's probably the right one. We need religion without its being exclusionary. And I mean, the risk of offending everybody, I think humanism, which is religion without God, is probably the best solution. If you have God, but it's my God versus your God, that's caused all the wars that I can think of.
Hmm.
Humanism was the God that failed, Arthur Koestler's favorite thing. And so if it's an exclusionary God, humanism basically says, they may be a God or not. What we share are that we're a part of a species which evolved over hundreds of millions of years. And in the last 50,000 years, we became more cognitive. We became more conscious of things. We began to develop moral codes and so on. This is a very precious achievement, and we need to try to preserve it while fashioning it in ways which keep it going rather than terminate it. And again, I'm not an expert in religion. When I hear about humanism, which is sort of religion without God, or Unitarianism and universalism, which is a branch of Christianity, but very, very non-exclusionary, I feel much more comfortable than I do. Let's take the Israel-Palestine conflict now, where it's either my God or your God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had the Crusades 1,000 years ago, where it was my God versus your God. And Henry VIII and the various Cromwells, 500 years was my God or your God. And you can fill in the blanks now. In
Right.
China versus Taiwan,
Right.
it's the Marx God.
Right. It's the in-group, out-group. My party versus your party is the other one that's very much top of mind now at the we versus they. And, how do we embrace a more holistic we, I guess, is one of the foundational challenges that we're talking about. It's been an amazing conversation. I'm talking to Howard Gardner, his new collections of works, The Essential Howard Gardner on Education and The Essential Howard Gardner on Mind. Howard is holding them up now for those of you viewing this. They're both available. Also, he's howardgardner.com. You can spend quite a bit of time there looking at an incredible body of work over a really amazing career. Howard, as we're getting closer to conclusion here, I'd love any concluding thoughts, any ways to sum up kind of where we're at, or reflection back on some of the topics and themes that we've had in our conversation today.
Sure. Well, I begin by saying that I'm extraordinarily lucky. I'm in reasonable health, family that's in reasonable health. We love each other. And I managed to be born in the right time. My parents were German Jews. They escaped in the nick of time. They arrived in the United States on November 9th, 1938, the famous night of the shattered glass, where many relatives were killed, imprisoned, thrown out of windows. And I realized that I'm incredibly lucky, and I would like some of that luck not to stop with me and my generation. I've also been lucky because I've been a scholar at a time when you could explore what you wanted to do and write about it honestly. I fear for that. I censor myself much more carefully now than I would have even 20 years ago. That's very frightening because I've been scattered or disparate or versatile. You can choose your adjective. I've been able to put these two books together, one summarizing my work in education, which is what I'm best known for, but the other talking about the artistic mind, the shattered mind, the 5 minds for the future, which we didn't talk about today, the mind of artificial intelligence. And the last thing I would say is that I'm not going to write any more books, but I blog all the time. I posted several hundred blogs in the last few years. I blog about what I'm thinking about, and I even invited Michael, if he wants to do a blog on influencing, he's welcome to do that. And as I mentioned in the last essay I wrote, had I wrote enough in time, I talk about the line of work, which I hope people after me will follow. And that's a kind of, you might say, mass market mentoring, because it's just the students and the children and grandchildren whom I can embrace, but they're close by. But there's anybody anywhere who says, the study of intelligences and the study of minds for the future and the understanding of what it means to be a good worker and a good citizen, that shouldn't stop just because Howard Gardner is 6 feet under. That should continue with me and my colleagues and friends trying to take the next step. And that's, we might call mass mentoring. It sounds like a little bit like a oxymoron, because mentoring should be personal, but it is possible to be a positive influencer, even if you're no longer there. And of course, the people whom we most admired, I mentioned them before, but I could have mentioned Joan of Arc, or I could have mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt. We could have mentioned Mother Teresa. They can be different genders. They could be different ethnicities. That's what we should try to carry on. And please don't think that Elon Musk is the most important person on the planet, because he's not.
Amazing stuff with Howard Gardner here today. Howard, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for giving me the chance to wander and to wonder with you.
Amazing stuff. And our listeners, if you liked what you heard, please write us a review, subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.
Thanks very much, Michael.